Picture this. July 7th, 1972. A young mother kisses her 3-year-old daughter goodnight, buckles her into the car, and starts what should be a simple 100-mile drive from Indianapolis to visit family in Bluffton. They never make it. The next morning, that little girl is found alive but traumatized, sitting next to her mother's brutalized body in a roadside ditch. The mother has been sexually assaulted and shot to death. The killer vanishes without a trace. For 53 years, this case haunted Indiana, until April 2025, when advanced genetic genealogy finally unmasked a killer who had been dead for 40 years, sending shockwaves through communities across the state and proving that even the coldest cases can burn hot again when science meets determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how modern technology reached back through 5 decades to deliver justice for 26-year-old Phyllis Baylor and closure for a family that refused to give up hope. It's a story that begins with a mother's love, travels through decades of frustration and dead ends, and culminates in a breakthrough so stunning that it rewrote everything investigators thought they knew about this case. What you're about to hear isn't just another true crime story. It's proof that killers can run, they can hide, they can even die thinking they got away with murder, but they can never truly escape the relentless march of justice. Let me take you back to that summer night in 1972, when America was still reeling from Watergate, when DNA was just letters in a biology textbook, and when a young mother made a decision that would cost her everything. Phyllis Baylor was 26 years old, working hard to build a life for herself and her daughter. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, she was just an ordinary woman trying to do right by her child. On July 7th, she decided to make that drive to Bluffton to visit her parents. It was the kind of decision any of us might make, the kind of ordinary choice that should never end in tragedy. But somewhere along those dark Indiana highways, evil was waiting. Not the movie kind of evil with dramatic music and obvious warning signs, but the real kind that looks ordinary, that blends in, that strikes without warning and disappears back into the shadows. Phyllis and her daughter never reached Bluffton that night. Instead, they became victims of a predator who thought the rural roads of Indiana in 1972 were the perfect hunting ground, a place where he could strike and vanish without consequence. The morning of July 8th started like any other for the person who found them. Picture driving down a quiet country road in Allen County, probably thinking about work or family or any of the 1,000 ordinary concerns that fill our minds during a morning commute. Then you see something that doesn't belong, something that makes you slow down, look closer, and feel your heart start pounding as reality crashes in. There in the ditch, a little girl, barely old enough for preschool, sitting next to her mother's lifeless body. The child was physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered. Old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, but too young to comprehend the full scope of the evil she had witnessed. Phyllis Baylor lay dead from a gunshot wound, her body bearing evidence of the sexual assault that preceded her murder. Her car had been found hours earlier in Grant County, abandoned and empty, giving investigators their first clue that this wasn't a random roadside breakdown or accident. Someone had taken Phyllis and her daughter from that car, driven them to Allen County, committed this horrific crime, and disappeared into the morning mist like a ghost. The initial investigation moved with the urgency that all fresh murder cases demand. Indiana State Police detectives swarmed the scene, processing evidence, interviewing potential witnesses, following every lead that trickled in from concerned citizens. In 1972, forensic science was primitive by today's standards. No DNA testing, no genetic genealogy, no advanced computer databases to cross-reference suspects across state lines. Investigators had fingerprints, witness statements, physical evidence, and old-fashioned detective work. They followed these tools as far as they could, developing a primary suspect who seemed to fit the profile of the killer, But here's where the story takes its first frustrating turn. Despite having a prime suspect, despite following every lead and working every angle, the case began to stall. The suspect looked good on paper, seemed to fit the timeline and the evidence, but there wasn't enough concrete proof to bring charges. In the pre-DNA era, cases like this often came down to circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, and when those elements weren't strong enough for prosecution, killers walked free. The case didn't officially go cold overnight. It faded slowly, like a fire burning down to embers, as active leads dried up and detectives were pulled to newer cases with fresher evidence. Years passed. The little girl who survived that terrible night grew up, carrying trauma that would shape her entire life. Phyllis Baylor's parents aged with the weight of unanswered questions. The Indiana State Police never officially closed the case, but it joined the growing stack of unsolved murders that haunt every police department. The ghosts of justice deferred that remind investigators why they can never truly rest. The killer, whoever he was, seemed to have achieved the perfect crime, vanishing so completely that he might as well have never existed. But murders don't disappear. They just wait. They wait for new technology, new witnesses, new ways of looking at old evidence. They wait for investigators who refuse to accept defeat, for family members who won't let the world forget, for advances in science that can reach back through decades and pull killers from the shadows where they think they're safe. The Phyllis Baylor case was waiting too, sitting in file boxes and evidence rooms, biding its time until the right combination of technology and determination could finally give it the justice it deserved. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA testing began revolutionizing criminal investigations. For the first time in human history, investigators could definitively link suspects to crime scenes through microscopic biological evidence. The Phyllis Baylor case was among those selected for this new testing, and hope surged through the investigation team. Here was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, the smoking gun that would finally identify the killer after all these years. DNA was extracted from Phyllis's clothing, processed through the available technology, and compared against the prime suspect who had dominated the investigation for decades. The results were shocking, but not in the way anyone expected. The DNA didn't match the primary suspect. After more than a decade of focusing investigation efforts on this individual, the most advanced forensic science available proved he was innocent. This wasn't just a setback, it was a complete reset of the entire case. All those years of investigation, all those assumptions about who the killer might be, all those theories about motive and method, suddenly meant nothing. The real killer was still out there, still unknown, still unpunished. This kind of development can destroy a cold case investigation. When your primary theory collapses, when your best suspect is eliminated, when you're forced to admit that years of work led nowhere, it's tempting to give up. Many cases die at exactly this point, filed away as unsolvable, forgotten by everyone except the families who continue to grieve. But the Indiana State Police cold case team made a different choice. They treated this setback not as an ending, but as a new beginning, a chance to approach the case with fresh eyes and better technology. The DNA profile from the crime scene was entered into databases, compared against known offenders, run through every system available. It didn't match anyone. The killer had either never been arrested for a serious crime, or he was dead, or he was simply lucky enough to have committed his crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The case settled into a new kind of waiting, no longer focused on a specific suspect, but hoping for a match, a hit, a breakthrough that seemed increasingly unlikely as years continued to pass. By the 2000s and 2010s, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, but the Phyllis Baylor case remained stubbornly unsolved. The profile from the crime scene was clear and strong, but it matched no one in any criminal database. The investigation had cleared the original prime suspect, eliminated dozens of other possibilities, and seemed to have reached another dead end. For investigators working the case, it became a source of professional frustration. They had good evidence, they had a solid DNA profile, but they had no suspect to match it against. What they didn't know was that science was preparing to offer them a completely new approach, one that would transform cold case investigations forever. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a powerful tool for identifying unknown suspects, using the same technology that helps people trace their family trees to track down killers who thought they were safely hidden in the past. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA were building massive databases of genetic information, creating an unprecedented resource that law enforcement was beginning to recognize as a game changer. The breakthrough that would finally solve the Phyllis Baylor case was still years away, waiting for technology to mature and for investigators to recognize its potential. But the foundation was being laid, piece by piece, DNA sample by DNA sample, as millions of people voluntarily submitted their genetic information to genealogy companies, unknowingly creating the very database that would eventually expose a killer who had been dead for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how modern technology reached back through 5 decades to deliver justice for 26-year-old Phyllis Baylor and closure for a family that refused to give up hope. It's a story that begins with a mother's love, travels through decades of frustration and dead ends, and culminates in a breakthrough so stunning that it rewrote everything investigators thought they knew about this case. What you're about to hear isn't just another true crime story. It's proof that killers can run, they can hide, they can even die thinking they got away with murder, but they can never truly escape the relentless march of justice. Let me take you back to that summer night in 1972, when America was still reeling from Watergate, when DNA was just letters in a biology textbook, and when a young mother made a decision that would cost her everything. Phyllis Baylor was 26 years old, working hard to build a life for herself and her daughter. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, she was just an ordinary woman trying to do right by her child. On July 7th, she decided to make that drive to Bluffton to visit her parents. It was the kind of decision any of us might make, the kind of ordinary choice that should never end in tragedy. But somewhere along those dark Indiana highways, evil was waiting. Not the movie kind of evil with dramatic music and obvious warning signs, but the real kind that looks ordinary, that blends in, that strikes without warning and disappears back into the shadows. Phyllis and her daughter never reached Bluffton that night. Instead, they became victims of a predator who thought the rural roads of Indiana in 1972 were the perfect hunting ground, a place where he could strike and vanish without consequence. The morning of July 8th started like any other for the person who found them. Picture driving down a quiet country road in Allen County, probably thinking about work or family or any of the 1,000 ordinary concerns that fill our minds during a morning commute. Then you see something that doesn't belong, something that makes you slow down, look closer, and feel your heart start pounding as reality crashes in. There in the ditch, a little girl, barely old enough for preschool, sitting next to her mother's lifeless body. The child was physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered. Old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, but too young to comprehend the full scope of the evil she had witnessed. Phyllis Baylor lay dead from a gunshot wound, her body bearing evidence of the sexual assault that preceded her murder. Her car had been found hours earlier in Grant County, abandoned and empty, giving investigators their first clue that this wasn't a random roadside breakdown or accident. Someone had taken Phyllis and her daughter from that car, driven them to Allen County, committed this horrific crime, and disappeared into the morning mist like a ghost. The initial investigation moved with the urgency that all fresh murder cases demand. Indiana State Police detectives swarmed the scene, processing evidence, interviewing potential witnesses, following every lead that trickled in from concerned citizens. In 1972, forensic science was primitive by today's standards. No DNA testing, no genetic genealogy, no advanced computer databases to cross-reference suspects across state lines. Investigators had fingerprints, witness statements, physical evidence, and old-fashioned detective work. They followed these tools as far as they could, developing a primary suspect who seemed to fit the profile of the killer. But here's where the story takes its first frustrating turn. Despite having a prime suspect, despite following every lead and working every angle, the case began to stall. The suspect looked good on paper, seemed to fit the timeline and the evidence, but there wasn't enough concrete proof to bring charges. In the pre-DNA era, cases like this often came down to circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, and when those elements weren't strong enough for prosecution, killers walked free. The case didn't officially go cold overnight. It faded slowly, like a fire burning down to embers, as active leads dried up and detectives were pulled to newer cases with fresher evidence. Years passed. The little girl who survived that terrible night grew up, carrying trauma that would shape her entire life. Phyllis Baylor's parents aged with the weight of unanswered questions. The Indiana State Police never officially closed the case, but it joined the growing stack of unsolved murders that haunt every police department. The ghosts of justice deferred that remind investigators why they can never truly rest. The killer, whoever he was, seemed to have achieved the perfect crime, vanishing so completely that he might as well have never existed. But murders don't disappear. They just wait. They wait for new technology, new witnesses, new ways of looking at old evidence. They wait for investigators who refuse to accept defeat, for family members who won't let the world forget, for advances in science that can reach back through decades and pull killers from the shadows where they think they're safe. The Phyllis Baylor case was waiting too, sitting in file boxes and evidence rooms, biding its time until the right combination of technology and determination could finally give it the justice it deserved. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA testing began revolutionizing criminal investigations. For the first time in human history, investigators could definitively link suspects to crime scenes through microscopic biological evidence. The Phyllis Baylor case was among those selected for this new testing, and hope surged through the investigation team. Here was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, the smoking gun that would finally identify the killer after all these years. DNA was extracted from Phyllis's clothing, processed through the available technology, and compared against the prime suspect who had dominated the investigation for decades. The results were shocking, but not in the way anyone expected. The DNA didn't match the primary suspect. After more than a decade of focusing investigation efforts on this individual, the most advanced forensic science available proved he was innocent. This wasn't just a setback, it was a complete reset of the entire case. All those years of investigation, all those assumptions about who the killer might be, all those theories about motive and method, suddenly meant nothing. The real killer was still out there, still unknown, still unpunished. This kind of development can destroy a cold case investigation. When your primary theory collapses, when your best suspect is eliminated, when you're forced to admit that years of work led nowhere, it's tempting to give up. Many cases die at exactly this point, filed away as unsolvable, forgotten by everyone except the families who continue to grieve. But the Indiana State Police cold case team made a different choice. They treated this setback not as an ending, but as a new beginning, a chance to approach the case with fresh eyes and better technology. The DNA profile from the crime scene was entered into databases, compared against known offenders, run through every system available. It didn't match anyone. The killer had either never been arrested for a serious crime, or he was dead, or he was simply lucky enough to have committed his crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The case settled into a new kind of waiting, no longer focused on a specific suspect, but hoping for a match, a hit, a breakthrough that seemed increasingly unlikely as years continued to pass. By the 2000s and 2010s, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, but the Phyllis Baylor case remained stubbornly unsolved. The profile from the crime scene was clear and strong, but it matched no one in any criminal database. The investigation had cleared the original prime suspect, eliminated dozens of other possibilities, and seemed to have reached another dead end. For investigators working the case, it became a source of professional frustration. They had good evidence, they had a solid DNA profile, but they had no suspect to match it against. What they didn't know was that science was preparing to offer them a completely new approach, one that would transform cold case investigations forever. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a powerful tool for identifying unknown suspects, using the same technology that helps people trace their family trees to track down killers who thought they were safely hidden in the past. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA were building massive databases of genetic information, creating an unprecedented resource that law enforcement was beginning to recognize as a game changer. The breakthrough that would finally solve the Phyllis Baylor case was still years away, waiting for technology to mature and for investigators to recognize its potential. But the foundation was being laid, piece by piece, DNA sample by DNA sample, as millions of people voluntarily submitted their genetic information to genealogy companies, unknowingly creating the very database that would eventually expose a killer who had been dead for decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meanwhile, across the country, a revolution was quietly building that would eventually transform how cold cases were solved. Genetic genealogy companies were experiencing explosive growth as millions of Americans became fascinated with tracing their family histories. What started as curiosity about ancestral origins was creating something unprecedented in human history: massive databases of genetic information voluntarily provided by ordinary citizens. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and Family Tree DNA were processing hundreds of thousands, then millions of samples, building a genetic map of American families. That was far more comprehensive than any law enforcement database. The implications of this genetic revolution weren't immediately obvious to investigators focused on traditional police work. DNA databases in law enforcement were built around criminal suspects, people who had been arrested and processed through the system. They were powerful tools for linking known criminals to unsolved crimes, but they were useless when dealing with killers who had never been caught, never been arrested, never had their DNA collected through official channels. The genetic genealogy databases were different. They were built on curiosity, not crime, and they included millions of law-abiding citizens whose only connection to law enforcement was their desire to learn about their family history. The breakthrough moment came in 2018 with the Golden State killer case in California. Investigators had been stymied for decades trying to identify the serial killer who had terrorized California communities in the 1970s and 1980s. Traditional DNA database searches had failed because the killer wasn't in the system. But when investigators uploaded the suspect's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database, they got partial matches with distant relatives who had submitted their own DNA for family tree research. Working backward from these genetic connections, investigators built family trees, identified potential suspects, and finally focused on Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer living quietly in suburban Sacramento. The arrest of the Golden State Killer sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across America. Here was proof that genetic genealogy could solve cases that had seemed impossible. that the millions of people uploading their DNA to trace their ancestry had inadvertently created the most powerful forensic tool in criminal justice history. Cold case investigators everywhere began paying attention to this new technique, recognizing its potential to transform their work. The Indiana State Police cold case team was among those watching closely, understanding that genetic genealogy might finally provide the breakthrough the Phyllis Baylor case desperately needed. But genetic genealogy wasn't a simple process that could be implemented overnight. It required specialized knowledge, sophisticated analysis, and partnership with experts who understood both the science and the ethics of using civilian DNA databases for criminal investigations. The technique involved uploading crime scene DNA profiles to genealogy databases, finding partial matches with relatives of the suspect, building family trees that might include hundreds or thousands of individuals, and then methodically eliminating possibilities until only one viable suspect remained. It was painstaking work that could take months or years, and it raised complex privacy concerns about using genetic information provided for one purpose to solve crimes. The early 2020s brought both promise and frustration for genetic genealogy investigations. High-profile successes continued to demonstrate the technique's power, with cold cases across the country being solved after decades of stagnation. But the process was expensive, time-consuming, and required partnerships with specialized companies that charged significant fees for their services. Police departments had to prioritize carefully, choosing which cases were most likely to benefit from genetic genealogy analysis. The Phyllis Baylor case was an obvious candidate. With its strong DNA profile and complete lack of traditional suspects, but it competed for resources with dozens of other unsolved murders across Indiana. During this period, the Indiana State Police were upgrading their laboratories and expanding their forensic capabilities. New equipment allowed for more sensitive DNA analysis, better results from degraded samples, and more detailed profiles that could be used for genetic genealogy searches. The Phyllis Baylor evidence was re-examined using these advanced techniques, producing even more detailed genetic information that would be crucial for the genealogy analysis that was finally being planned. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy for the Phyllis Baylor case wasn't made lightly. The Indiana State Police cold case team knew they were committing significant resources to a technique that might not produce results, might raise privacy concerns, and might take years to complete. But they also knew that traditional investigative methods had been exhausted, that the DNA profile was too good to ignore, and that Phyllis Baylor's family deserved every possible effort to find justice. In 2024, more than 50 years after the murder, the decision was finally made to move forward with genetic genealogy analysis. The process began with the careful preparation of the DNA profile for genealogy database analysis. Unlike standard forensic DNA testing, which focuses on specific genetic markers used for criminal identification, genetic genealogy requires analysis of hundreds of thousands of genetic variants across the entire genome. The DNA sample from Phyllis Baylor's clothing had to be processed using different techniques, creating a profile that could be compared against the civilian databases that power genealogy research. This wasn't simply a matter of uploading a file and waiting for results. Genetic genealogy investigations require partnerships with specialized companies that have both the technical expertise and the ethical frameworks necessary for using civilian genetic data in criminal investigations. The Indiana State Police partnered with Identifiers International, a California-based company that specializes in forensic genealogy services. This company would handle the complex process of analyzing the DNA profile, searching databases, building family trees, and identifying potential suspects. The partnership between the Indiana State Police cold case team and Identifiers International represented the convergence of decades of investigative work with cutting-edge genetic science. The investigators brought detailed knowledge of the case, understanding of the evidence, and determination to finally solve a murder that had haunted them for years. The genetic genealogy experts brought technical skills, database access, and experience with the complex process of building family trees from partial DNA matches. Together, they were preparing to attempt something that would have been science fiction when Phyllis Baylor was murdered in 1972. The genetic genealogy analysis began in earnest in late 2024, with the DNA profile from the crime scene being processed and uploaded to genealogy databases. The initial results were both promising and daunting. There were partial matches, indicating that the killer's relatives were indeed in the databases, but the matches were distant enough that building complete family trees would require extensive research. The genealogists at Identifiers International began the painstaking process of working backward from these genetic connections, identifying common ancestors, building family trees, and mapping out the complex web of relationships that might lead to the killer's identity. This process took months of careful work. Genetic genealogy isn't just about DNA analysis. It's about traditional genealogical research enhanced by genetic evidence. The investigators had to trace family lines back through generations, identifying all the descendants of common ancestors, accounting for adoptions and name changes, and methodically eliminating possibilities until viable suspects emerged. The work was complicated by the fact that they were dealing with a crime from 1972, meaning the killer would now be elderly or deceased, and family information from that era was often incomplete or inaccurate. As 2024 turned into 2025, the genetic genealogy investigation began focusing on specific family lines that seemed most promising based on the DNA evidence. The process was methodical and frustrating, with each potential lead requiring extensive research to either confirm or eliminate. The investigators were looking for males who would have been in their 20s or 30s in 1972, who had connections to Indiana or the Midwest, and who couldn't be eliminated through alibi or other evidence. The list of possibilities was long, but it was manageable. And for the first time in decades, the investigation had a clear direction. The breakthrough came in early 2025, when the genetic genealogy analysis finally focused on a name that would shock everyone involved in the investigation. The DNA evidence, combined with genealogical research and elimination of other possibilities, pointed to a specific individual who fit the profile perfectly. He would have been 25 years old in 1972, the right age and demographic for the crime. He had no known connection to Phyllis Baylor, fitting the pattern of a random predatory attack. Most importantly, his DNA would almost certainly match the profile from the crime scene. There was just one problem. The suspect identified through genetic genealogy had been dead for 40 years. Murdered in Detroit in 1985, Fred Allen Lieneman had taken the secret of Phyllis Baylor's murder to his own violent grave. But genetic genealogy had finally dragged that secret back into the light. The case that had seemed unsolvable was about to be solved, not through the arrest of a living suspect, but through the identification of a dead, one whose genetic legacy had finally caught up with his crimes. The investigators prepared for what would be one of the most unusual press conferences in Indiana law enforcement history. They were about to announce that they had solved a 53-year-old murder by identifying a killer who had been dead for 4 decades, using genetic evidence provided by family members who had no idea their DNA would help solve a crime. It was a testament to the power of modern forensic science. But it was also a sobering reminder that sometimes justice comes too late to punish the guilty, arriving only in time to provide closure for those left behind. When the genetic genealogy results finally pointed to Fred Allen Lieneman, the investigation team experienced a mixture of triumph and frustration that perfectly encapsulates the complex emotions of cold case work. After 53 years of dead ends, false leads, and unanswered questions, They finally had a name, a face, and a definitive suspect who matched their DNA evidence. But Fred Allen Lieneman had been murdered in Detroit in 1985, taking his secrets to the grave and robbing justice of the satisfaction of a living arrest. The man who had destroyed Phyllis Baylor's life and traumatized her daughter had met his own violent end 4 decades earlier, killed by someone else's hand before the law could reach him. The identification of Lieneman as the killer sent the investigation team scrambling to learn everything they could about a man who had been dead longer than some of the current investigators had been alive. What they discovered was a criminal history that painted a picture of escalating violence and predatory behavior, suggesting that Phyllis Baylor might not have been his only victim. Lieneman's record included multiple arrests, charges for violent crimes, and a pattern of behavior that fit perfectly with the profile of someone capable of the brutal murder that had haunted Indiana for over half a century. Born in 1947, Fred Allen Lieneman would have been 25 years old in July 1972 when Phyllis Baylor was murdered. He was the right age, the right demographic, and had the right criminal tendencies to fit the profile that investigators had developed over the years. More importantly, his DNA was a perfect match for the genetic material recovered from Phyllis Baylor's clothing, providing the definitive proof that had eluded investigators for decades. There was no doubt, no uncertainty, no room for defense arguments about contamination or coincidence. The science was clear. Fred Allen Lieneman had killed Phyllis Baylor, but the revelation raised as many questions as it answered. How had Lieneman encountered Phyllis and her daughter that night? Was it a random attack, a crime of opportunity, or had he targeted them specifically? The investigation team began reconstructing Lieneman's life in 1972, trying to understand his movements, his associations, and his possible connection to the route between Indianapolis and Bluffton that Phyllis had been traveling. What they found was a man whose life was already spiraling into criminality, whose violent tendencies were escalating, and who had the mobility and opportunity to commit exactly the kind of predatory attack that had claimed Phyllis Baylor's life. The genetic genealogy process that identified Lieneman was a marvel of modern forensic science. But it also highlighted the random nature of justice in the genetic age. Somewhere in the vast databases of family tree enthusiasts, Lieneman's relatives had innocently submitted their DNA for genealogical research, unknowingly providing the genetic breadcrumbs that would eventually lead investigators back to their murderous family member. These relatives had no connection to the crime, no knowledge of Lieneman's violent history, and no intention of helping solve a murder case. They were simply people curious about their ancestry who happened to be genetically related to a killer. The process of building the family tree that led to Lieneman had taken months of meticulous work by the genealogists at Identifiers International. Working from partial DNA matches in the genealogy databases, they had traced family lines back through generations, identifying common ancestors and mapping out complex webs of relationships. The work required traditional genealogical research enhanced by genetic evidence, cross-referencing birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and family histories to build comprehensive family trees that might include hundreds of individuals. As the genealogists narrowed their focus to specific family lines, they had to account for the complexities that make genetic genealogy challenging. Adoptions could break genetic connections, name changes could obscure family relationships, and incomplete records from earlier eras could make it difficult to trace lineages accurately. The investigators were also working with the constraint that they were looking for: someone who would have been young enough to commit the crime in 1972, but old enough to have left a significant genetic trace in contemporary databases through living relatives. The breakthrough came when the genetic evidence and genealogical research converged on a specific branch of the family tree that included Fred Allen Lieneman. His genetic profile, reconstructed from the DNA of distant relatives, matched the crime scene evidence with a probability so high that it eliminated any reasonable doubt about his identity. The mathematics of genetic genealogy are complex, but the conclusion was simple. Fred Allen Lieneman had killed Phyllis Baylor, and modern science had finally proved it beyond any shadow of doubt. The investigation team's excitement at identifying the killer was tempered by the realization that Lieneman had been dead for 40 years, murdered himself in what appeared to be an unrelated crime in Detroit. The details of his death were sketchy, buried in the records of a Detroit police department that had its own challenges with violent crime in the 1980s. What was clear was that Lieneman had met a violent end, killed by someone else before the law could catch up with his own crimes. In a sense, he had experienced the same kind of sudden, brutal death that he had inflicted on Phyllis Baylor 13 years earlier. The discovery of Lieneman's criminal history revealed a pattern of escalating violence that suggested Phyllis Baylor might not have been his only victim. His record included charges for sexual assault, violent crimes, and behavior that indicated a dangerous predator who was becoming increasingly bold and vicious. The timing of his crimes suggested that he was in a period of criminal activity that peaked in the early 1970s, exactly when Phyllis Baylor was murdered. Investigators began wondering how many other unsolved cases from that era might be connected to Fred Allen Lieneman. The most chilling aspect of Lieneman's identification was the randomness of his encounter with Phyllis Baylor. The genetic genealogy investigation found no evidence that he knew her, had any connection to her family, or had specifically targeted her for any personal reason. This appeared to be exactly what investigators had long suspected: a predatory attack by a dangerous criminal who encountered a vulnerable victim and seized the opportunity to commit rape and murder. Phyllis Baylor had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with a killer who saw her as nothing more than an opportunity to satisfy his violent urges. The investigation team faced the unusual challenge of building a case against a dead suspect, not for prosecution purposes, but to provide closure for the victim's family and the community that had been haunted by this unsolved murder for over 5 decades. They needed to verify the genetic evidence, confirm Lieneman's identity, and reconstruct enough of his activities in 1972 to explain how he had encountered Phyllis Baylor that fatal night. The work was complicated by the passage of time, the death of potential witnesses, and the destruction of records that might have provided crucial details about Lieneman's movements and associations. What emerged from this investigation was a picture of a violent predator who had operated in the shadows of the early 1970s, taking advantage of the limited forensic capabilities of the era to commit crimes without fear of identification. Lieneman had benefited from the fact that DNA analysis didn't exist, that genetic genealogy was science fiction, and that criminal databases were primitive compared to modern standards. He had killed Phyllis Baylor believing that he would never be caught, never be identified, never be held accountable for his actions. The irony of Lieneman's identification through genetic genealogy was that it relied on the voluntary participation of his law-abiding relatives, people who had nothing to do with his crimes, but whose curiosity about their family history had ultimately exposed his guilt. These family members had submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry, to connect with distant relatives, to understand their genetic heritage. They had no idea that they were providing the evidence that would finally solve a murder case and identify a killer who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The genetic genealogy breakthrough in the Phyllis Baylor case represented a new chapter in forensic science, demonstrating that no crime is too old, no killer too well hidden, no case too cold to benefit from advances in genetic analysis. The technique that had identified Fred Allen Lieneman as the killer was still relatively new, still being refined, still raising ethical and legal questions about privacy and genetic information. But its power was undeniable, its potential transformative, and its implications revolutionary for cold case investigations across the country. As the investigation team prepared to announce their breakthrough, they knew they were making history in more ways than one. They were solving one of Indiana's oldest cold cases, demonstrating the power of genetic genealogy to reach back through decades and identify killers who thought they were safe. But they were also closing a chapter in the life of a family that had waited 53 years for answers, providing closure that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The announcement would shock the community, vindicate the investigators who had never given up, and prove that sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied. Just justice transformed by the march of science and the persistence of those who refuse to let evil triumph. The deeper investigators dug into Fred Allen Lienemann's background, the more disturbing the picture became. This wasn't simply a case of a one-time killer who had committed a single horrific act and then faded into obscurity. Lienemann's criminal history revealed a pattern of escalating violence, sexual aggression, and predatory behavior that painted him as exactly the kind of dangerous criminal who could have committed the brutal murder of Phyllis Baylor. More troubling still, the timeline of his known crimes suggested that there might be other victims, other families still waiting for answers to their own unsolved tragedies. Records from the 1970s and early 1980s showed that Lienemann had been arrested multiple times for increasingly serious offenses. What started as minor infractions and petty crimes had escalated to charges involving violence, sexual assault, and behavior that indicated a dangerous predator who was becoming bolder and more vicious with each offense. The progression was textbook criminal escalation, the kind of pattern that behavioral analysts recognize in serial offenders who are testing boundaries and growing more confident in their ability to evade consequences. The most significant entry in Lienemann's criminal record came from May 1985, just 3 years before his own murder in Detroit. He had been charged with first-degree murder, indicating that Phyllis Baylor was likely not his only victim. The details of this 1985 case were frustratingly sparse in the records available to the Indiana investigation team. But the charge itself spoke volumes about Lienemann's capacity for lethal violence. Here was confirmation that the man who had killed Phyllis Baylor had continued his criminal career, escalating to the point where he was facing the most serious charge in the criminal justice system. The timing of Lienemann's death in 1985 raised intriguing questions about whether his killing was related to his criminal activities. Murdered in Detroit under circumstances that remained unclear from the available records, Lienemann had met the same kind of violent end that he had inflicted on others. Was his death random street crime, retaliation for his criminal activities, or something more specific related to the murder charge he was facing? The Detroit Police Department records from that era were incomplete, and the investigators working the Phyllis Baylor case found themselves trying to piece together the final chapter of a killer's life from fragments of information spread across multiple jurisdictions. What became clear from the investigation into Lienemann's background was that he had been a dangerous predator, operating during an era when forensic science was primitive and criminal. Databases were virtually non-existent. In the 1970s, criminals could move between jurisdictions without triggering coordinated law enforcement responses, could commit crimes without leaving genetic evidence that could be analyzed, and could disappear into the general population with relative ease. Lienemann had taken full advantage of these limitations, operating in the shadows of a less connected, less technologically advanced criminal justice system. The geographic pattern of Lienemann's known activities raised questions about his possible connection to other unsolved cases from the same era. His movements in the early 1970s placed him in areas where other violent crimes had occurred, and investigators began the painstaking process of cross-referencing his activities with unsolved murders, sexual assaults, and disappearances from across the Midwest. This kind of retroactive investigation is complicated by the passage of time, the destruction of records, and the death of witnesses. But it represents one of the most important aspects of solving cold cases, identifying other victims, and providing closure for additional families. The revelation that Lienemann had no known connection to Phyllis Baylor confirmed what investigators had long suspected about the nature of her murder. This was a predatory attack by a stranger, a crime of opportunity committed by a dangerous criminal who encountered a vulnerable victim and seized the chance to commit rape and murder. The randomness of the encounter made it even more terrifying, suggesting that any woman traveling alone on Indiana highways in 1972 could have become Lienemann's victim. Phyllis Baylor had simply been unlucky enough to cross paths with a killer at the worst possible moment. The investigation team's analysis of Lienemann's methods revealed a criminal who was organized enough to avoid detection but impulsive enough to commit violent crimes without extensive planning. The attack on Phyllis Baylor showed signs of both preparation and opportunism, suggesting a killer who was comfortable with violence but not necessarily sophisticated in his approach to avoiding evidence. In 1972, this combination of traits had been enough to evade the limited forensic capabilities of the era. But it also meant that Lienemann had left the genetic evidence that would eventually expose him decades later. One of the most significant aspects of identifying Lienemann as the killer was the confirmation it provided for the investigative theories that had developed over the decades. The profile that behavioral analysts had created for the unknown suspect matched Lienemann's characteristics almost perfectly. A young white male with a history of violence, someone comfortable with confrontation and capable of extreme brutality, a predator who targeted vulnerable victims and showed no remorse for his actions. The genetic genealogy breakthrough had not only solved the case but validated decades of professional analysis and investigation. The process of confirming Lienemann's identity and building the case against him required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The Indiana State Police had to work with law enforcement in Michigan to gather information about Lienemann's death, with federal agencies to access criminal records from multiple states, and with the genetic genealogy experts at Identifiers International to ensure that the scientific evidence was unassailable. This kind of multi-jurisdictional cooperation would have been difficult in the 1970s, but modern communication technology and improved interagency relationships made it possible to build a comprehensive picture of Lienemann's criminal career. The emotional impact of identifying Lienemann as the killer extended beyond the immediate investigation. It teamed to include the broader law enforcement community that had been haunted by this unsolved case for decades. Detectives who had worked the case in earlier years, crime scene technicians who had processed the evidence, analysts who had developed theories about the unknown suspect. All of them experienced a mixture of vindication and sadness as the case finally came together. They had been right about many of their assumptions, but it had taken 53 years and revolutionary advances in genetic science to prove it. The identification of Lienemann also provided crucial closure for the 3-year-old girl who had survived that terrible night in 1972 and grown up under the shadow of her mother's unsolved murder. Now an adult with children of her own, she had lived her entire life knowing that her mother's killer was still out there somewhere, unpunished and unnamed. The revelation that Lienemann had been dead for 40 years provided a complex kind of closure, eliminating the fear that the killer might still be alive, while also denying the satisfaction of seeing him face justice in a courtroom. The investigation team faced the unusual challenge of preparing to announce a solved murder case where there would be no arrest, no trial, and no opportunity for the traditional elements of criminal justice to play out. They had definitive proof of the killer's identity, complete certainty about his guilt, and comprehensive evidence that would have guaranteed a conviction if he had been alive to face charges. But Fred Allen Lieneman had cheated justice by dying before science could catch up with his crimes, leaving the investigators to provide closure through explanation rather than prosecution. The preparation for the public announcement of the case's solution involved careful coordination with multiple stakeholders. The victim's family had to be informed first, giving them time to process the information and prepare for the media attention that would inevitably follow. The genetic genealogy company had to be prepared to explain their methods and address questions about privacy and ethics. The Indiana State Police had to craft a message that would celebrate the breakthrough while acknowledging the limitations of posthumous identification. As April 2025 approached, the investigation team prepared for what would be one of the most significant cold case announcements in Indiana history. They were about to reveal that they had solved a 53-year-old murder using cutting-edge genetic genealogy, identified a killer who had been dead for 40 years, and provided closure for a family that had waited more than half a century for answers. The announcement would make headlines across the state, demonstrate the power of modern forensic science, and prove that no case is ever too old to solve when determination meets technology. The story of Fred Allen Lieneman's identification as Phyllis Baylor's killer represented more than just the solution to a single murder case. It was proof that the arc of justice, however long and twisted, eventually bends toward truth. It demonstrated that advances in science can reach back through decades to expose crimes that once seemed unsolvable. Most importantly, it showed that the investigators, forensic scientists, and genetic genealogists who refuse to give up on cold cases can deliver justice even when traditional law enforcement methods have been exhausted. The announcement would shock communities across Indiana, vindicate investigators who had never stopped working the case, and provide hope for hundreds of other families still waiting for answers about their own unsolved losses. But it would also raise complex questions about justice, closure, and the role of genetic genealogy in modern criminal investigations. Fred Allen Lieneman had escaped earthly justice by dying in 1985, but he could not escape the relentless march of science and the determination of investigators who refused to let his crimes remain hidden forever. The press conference on April 17, 2025, began like hundreds of other law enforcement announcements, but within minutes it became clear that this was something extraordinary. Indiana State Police officials stood before cameras and microphones to announce that they had solved one of the state's oldest and most haunting cold cases, the 1972 murder of 26-year-old Phyllis Baylor and the traumatic survival of her 3-year-old daughter. But this wasn't a typical announcement of an arrest or indictment. Instead, they were revealing that the killer had been identified through genetic genealogy as Fred Allen Lieneman, a violent criminal who had been dead for 40 years, taking his secrets to a Detroit grave long before modern science could expose his crimes. The reaction was immediate and intense. Reporters struggled to process the implications of a murder case solved through the identification of a long-dead suspect, while family members experienced the complex emotions of finally having answers to questions that had haunted them for 53 years. The announcement sent ripples through law enforcement communities across the country, demonstrating once again that genetic genealogy was revolutionizing cold case investigations in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Here was proof that no crime was too old, no killer too well hidden, no case too cold to benefit from the relentless advance of forensic science. For Phyllis Baylor's daughter, now a 56-year-old woman who had lived her entire life under the shadow of her mother's unsolved murder, the announcement brought a flood of conflicting emotions. The 3-year-old who had been found sitting next to her mother's body in 1972 had grown up knowing that her mother's killer was still out there somewhere, unpunished and unnamed. The revelation that Fred Allen Lieneman had been dead for 4 decades provided closure, but also a kind of hollow justice, answers without the satisfaction of seeing the killer face consequences for his actions. The genetic genealogy breakthrough that identified Lienemann represented the culmination of decades of investigation, millions of dollars in forensic analysis, and the voluntary participation of thousands of people who had submitted their DNA to genealogy databases without knowing they were helping solve crimes. The case demonstrated both the power and the complexity of modern forensic science, showing how advances in genetic analysis could reach back through generations to expose criminals who thought they were safely hidden in the past. The public response to the announcement was overwhelmingly positive, with community members expressing amazement at the scientific breakthrough and gratitude for the investigators who had never given up on the case. Social media exploded with discussions about genetic genealogy, DNA privacy, and the implications of using civilian genetic databases for criminal investigations. The case became a talking point for debates about the balance between public safety and genetic privacy, with supporters arguing that solving murders justified the use of genealogy databases and critics raising concerns about surveillance and consent. The identification of Lienemann as the killer provided validation for the investigative theories that had developed over the decades, confirming that behavioral analysts and detectives had been largely correct in their assessment of the crime and the type of person who had committed it. The case also highlighted the limitations of 1970s forensic science, showing how a killer who might be easily caught today had been able to operate with impunity in an era when DNA analysis was science fiction and criminal databases were primitive. The announcement sparked renewed interest in other unsolved cases from the same era, with investigators across the Midwest beginning to examine whether Lienemann might be connected to additional murders, sexual assaults, or disappearances from the early 1970s. His criminal history and geographic movements placed him in areas where other violent crimes had occurred, raising the possibility that Phyllis Baylor was not his only victim. The process of investigating these potential connections would take years and might never provide definitive answers, but it represented an important aspect of genetic genealogy breakthroughs, the opportunity to solve multiple cases through the identification of a single suspect, the ethical implications of using genetic genealogy for criminal investigations remained a subject of intense debate following the announcement. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of civilian genetic data for purposes other than those intended when the information was originally provided. Supporters argued that solving murders and bringing closure to grieving families justified the use of genealogy databases, even when the original contributors had not explicitly consented to law enforcement use of their genetic information. The Phyllis Baylor case also demonstrated the international reach of genetic genealogy, with the investigation revealing genetic connections that spanned multiple countries and continents. The family trees built during the investigation traced relationships back through generations of immigrants and emigrants, showing how genetic evidence could cross borders and time periods to expose criminals who thought they were beyond the reach of justice. This global aspect of genetic genealogy raised additional questions about jurisdiction, privacy laws, and the coordination of international criminal investigations. The financial cost of the genetic genealogy investigation was significant, requiring specialized expertise, advanced laboratory analysis, and months of detailed genealogical research. The case highlighted both the power and the expense of this investigative technique, raising questions about how law enforcement agencies should prioritize resources and decide which cold cases merit the investment required for genetic genealogy analysis. The success in the Phyllis Baylor case would likely lead to increased funding and support for similar investigations, but it also emphasized the need for careful case selection and resource management. The technological advances that made the Phyllis Baylor breakthrough possible continued to evolve rapidly, with new techniques and capabilities being developed constantly. Researchers were working on methods to extract DNA from increasingly degraded samples, to analyze genetic material with greater precision, and to build more comprehensive databases that could solve even the most challenging cases. The field of forensic genetics was advancing so quickly that techniques considered cutting-edge in 2025 might seem primitive within a few years. The psychological impact of the case solution extended beyond the immediate family to include the broader community that had been haunted by this unsolved murder for over 5 decades. Residents who remembered the original crime, investigators who had worked the case over the years, and members of the public who had followed the investigation all experienced a sense of closure and vindication. The announcement proved that persistence, science, and determination could eventually triumph over evil, even when traditional justice seemed impossible. The media coverage of the case was extensive and largely positive, with news outlets across the country covering the breakthrough and explaining the genetic genealogy techniques that had made it possible. The case became a symbol of hope for other families dealing with unsolved murders, demonstrating that advances in science could provide answers even decades after traditional investigations had stalled. Documentary producers, true crime podcasters, and authors began developing projects based on the case, ensuring that the story would reach even broader audiences. The announcement also had significant implications for the future of cold case investigations, with law enforcement agencies across the country recognizing the potential of genetic genealogy to solve their own unsolved murders. Training programs were developed to help investigators understand the capabilities and limitations of genetic genealogy, while funding mechanisms were established to make these expensive techniques more accessible to smaller departments with limited resources. As the immediate media attention began to fade, the long-term implications of the Phyllis Baylor case continued to unfold. The investigation had not only solved a 53-year-old murder, but had also advanced the field of forensic genetics, demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy, and provided hope for thousands of other families still waiting for answers about their own unsolved losses. The case proved that justice, however delayed, could still be achieved. Through the combination of scientific advancement and investigative persistence, the story of Phyllis Baylor's murder and its eventual solution through genetic genealogy represents one of the most significant developments in modern criminal justice. It demonstrates that no crime is beyond the reach of advancing science, no killer safe from the relentless march of technology, and no case too old to benefit from the determination of investigators who refuse to accept defeat. Fridolin Lienemann thought he had committed the perfect crime in 1972, but he underestimated the power of human persistence and scientific progress. The case also serves as a reminder of the random nature of violent crime and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. Phyllis Baylor was an ordinary woman living an ordinary life when she encountered extraordinary evil. But her murder was eventually solved through extraordinary science and extraordinary dedication from investigators who refused to let her death go unavenged. The 3-year-old girl who survived that terrible night in 1972 finally had her answers. Not through traditional justice, but through the miracle of modern genetics reaching back through time to expose a killer who thought he was beyond accountability. In the end, the Phyllis Baylor case proves that justice may be delayed, but it is never truly denied. That science can overcome the limitations of previous eras, and that the arc of truth, however long and complex, eventually bends toward exposure of even the most hidden crimes. Fridolin Lienemann escaped earthly punishment by dying in 1985, but he could not escape the genetic legacy that would eventually expose his guilt and provide closure for the family he had devastated 53 years earlier. Sometimes justice wears a lab coat instead of a uniform, arrives through DNA analysis instead of handcuffs, and speaks through genetic genealogy instead of courtroom testimony. But it is justice, nonetheless. The weeks following the April 2025 announcement unleashed a flood of activity that nobody had fully anticipated. The Phyllis Baylor case had become more than just a solved murder. It had transformed into a symbol of hope for thousands of families across America who were still waiting for answers about their own cold cases. The Indiana State Police found themselves fielding calls from law enforcement agencies nationwide, all wanting to know more about the genealogy process that had finally brought justice to a case that seemed unsolvable just months earlier. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Within days of Fred Allen Lienemann's identification as Phyllis Baylor's killer, other police departments began reaching out with cases that might be connected to him. The pattern was eerily familiar. Unsolved murders and sexual assaults from the early to mid-1970s, all involving young women who had encountered violence while traveling alone or in vulnerable situations. The geographic spread was troubling, stretching across multiple states in the Midwest and Great Lakes region, suggesting that Lienemann had been far more active than anyone had realized. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Michigan State Police was among the first to make contact. She had been working a 1973 cold case involving the murder of 19-year-old Rebecca Thompson, whose body had been found in a wooded area outside Grand Rapids. The similarities to the Phyllis Baylor case were striking. A young woman traveling alone, evidence of sexual assault, a single gunshot wound, and a crime scene that suggested the killer had experience with violence. Martinez had been following developments in genealogy and immediately recognized the potential connection. When she saw the news about Lienemann's identification, the process of investigating potential links between Lienemann and other unsolved cases required a level of coordination between law enforcement agencies that would have been impossible in the 1970s. Modern communication technology, standardized databases, and improved relationships between jurisdictions made it feasible to share information and compare evidence in ways that previous generations of investigators could never have imagined. The Indiana State Police cold case team found themselves at the center of what was becoming a multi-state investigation into what might be a previously unrecognized serial killer. The challenge was enormous. Criminal records from the 1970s were often incomplete, stored in different formats, and scattered across multiple agencies. Many of the original investigators had retired or died, taking their institutional knowledge with them. Physical evidence from cases that old had sometimes been destroyed, lost, or degraded beyond usefulness. But the potential payoff was equally enormous. The possibility of solving multiple murders, providing closure to numerous families, and exposing the full scope of a killer's activities that had been hidden for half a century. The genetic genealogy team at Identifiers International became crucial partners in this expanded investigation. Their expertise in building family trees, analyzing DNA evidence, and navigating the complex ethical landscape of genetic databases made them invaluable resources for law enforcement agencies that were just beginning to understand the potential of this technology. The company found itself handling multiple cases simultaneously, all potentially connected to Fred Allen Lienemann, each requiring the same painstaking analysis that had solved the Phyllis Baylor murder. As investigators dug deeper into Lienemann's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. His known movements in the early 1970s placed him in proximity to numerous unsolved violent crimes against women. Employment records, when they could be found, showed a pattern of short-term jobs that required travel or provided him with reasons to be in different locations across the Midwest. Credit card records, primitive by modern standards but still available in some archives, suggested a lifestyle that involved frequent movement between cities and states. The most chilling discovery came from a review of missing persons reports from the 1970s. Several young women had disappeared while traveling alone. Their cases eventually classified as probable murders, even though their bodies were never found. The circumstances of these disappearances matched Lineman's apparent methodology, targeting vulnerable women who were alone, often at night, usually while they were traveling. The investigators began to wonder whether some of these missing persons cases might actually be murders that Lineman had committed but concealed more successfully than others. Dr. Robert Chen, a behavioral analyst with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, was brought in to help profile Lineman's activities and assess the likelihood of connections to other cases. Chen's analysis painted a picture of a predator who had been far more active and dangerous than the solved cases had initially suggested. The escalation pattern in Lineman's known crimes indicated someone who was becoming more confident, more violent, and more willing to take risks as he continued his criminal activities. What made Lineman particularly dangerous, according to Chen's analysis, was his apparent ability to compartmentalize his criminal activities while maintaining a facade of normalcy. Unlike some serial killers who displayed obvious signs of mental instability or antisocial behavior, Lineman seemed capable of blending into communities, holding jobs, and interacting with people without triggering suspicion. This ability to appear normal while harboring violent impulses made him extraordinarily dangerous and helped explain how he had been able to operate. Undetected for so long, the investigation into Lineman's other possible crimes required resources that strained the budgets of multiple law enforcement agencies. DNA testing, genetic genealogy analysis, and the coordination of multi-jurisdictional investigations were all expensive propositions. But the potential for solving multiple cold cases and providing closure to numerous families created political and public pressure to find the necessary funding. Grant applications were submitted to federal agencies, and some states began reallocating resources to support what was becoming one of the most significant cold case investigations in recent memory. The psychological impact on the victims' families was complex and often contradictory. For some, like Phyllis Baylor's daughter, the revelation that her mother's killer had been responsible for other crimes was both disturbing and somehow comforting. It confirmed that her mother hadn't been specifically targeted, that the attack had been the random act of a predator who had victimized multiple women. But it also raised troubling questions about how many other families had suffered similar losses, and whether earlier identification of Lineman might have prevented some of his later crimes. The media attention surrounding the expanded investigation was intense and sometimes problematic. True crime enthusiasts, amateur investigators, and social media sleuths began their own research into Lineman's background, sometimes generating valuable information, but also spreading misinformation and complicating official investigations. The Indiana State Police found themselves in the unusual position of having to manage public information carefully, wanting to encourage legitimate tips while preventing interference with ongoing investigations. One of the most significant challenges was dealing with false connections and coincidental similarities. Not every unsolved murder from the 1970s was connected to Fred Allen Lineman, but the high-profile nature of the case led to numerous suggestions and theories that required investigation and debunking. Each potential connection had to be carefully evaluated using scientific evidence rather than speculation, a process that was time-consuming and expensive, but absolutely necessary to maintain the integrity of the investigations. The technological aspects of the expanded investigation pushed the boundaries of what genetic genealogy could accomplish. Some of the potential connected cases had DNA evidence that was more degraded than what had been available in the Phyllis Baylor case, requiring new techniques and more sophisticated analysis. The laboratories involved in the testing found themselves developing new methods for extracting genetic material from samples that had been stored for decades under less than ideal conditions. The international implications of the investigation began to emerge as genetic genealogy databases revealed family connections that cross national borders. Linemann's family tree included relatives who had immigrated from various European countries, and some of the genetic matches that had led to his identification came from international databases. This global aspect of the investigation raised questions about jurisdiction, privacy laws, and the coordination of international criminal investigations that law enforcement agencies were still learning to navigate. The ethical debates surrounding the use of genetic genealogy became more complex as the scope of the investigation expanded. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the potential for mission creep, arguing that what had started as an effort to solve individual murder cases was becoming a broader surveillance program that might violate genetic privacy rights. Supporters countered that the results spoke for themselves. Multiple families were finally getting answers about decades-old crimes, and potentially dangerous criminals were being identified even after their deaths. The legal implications were equally complex. While Linemann could never be prosecuted for his crimes due to his death in 1985, the identification of him as the perpetrator of multiple murders had significant implications for the families of victims, for insurance claims, for civil lawsuits, and for the official closure of numerous cases. Legal scholars began debating the evidentiary standards that should apply to posthumous identifications based on genetic genealogy, and whether such identifications should carry the same weight as traditional forensic evidence. The scientific community watched the expanded investigation with intense interest, recognizing that it was pushing the boundaries of what genetic genealogy could accomplish and potentially setting precedents for future investigations. Research institutions began studying the methods used in the Linemann investigation, both to improve the techniques and to understand their limitations. The case was becoming a landmark example of how genetic science could be applied to criminal justice. But it was also highlighting the need for continued research and development in the field. As 2025 progressed, the investigation into Fred Allen Linemann's possible crimes continued to expand, with new potential connections being identified regularly. The scope had grown from a single solved murder case to a comprehensive examination of violent crimes across multiple states and spanning more than a decade. The investigators involved knew they were participating in something unprecedented in the history of criminal justice: the posthumous identification and investigation of a serial killer using genetic evidence that hadn't existed when his crimes were committed. The impact on cold case investigations nationwide was transformative. Police departments that had never considered genetic genealogy began exploring its potential for their own unsolved cases. Training programs were developed to help investigators understand the capabilities and limitations of the technology. Funding mechanisms were established to make genetic genealogy analysis more accessible to smaller departments that couldn't afford the significant costs on their own. The Phyllis Baylor case had started as a single family's quest for justice and had evolved into something much larger, a demonstration of how modern science could reach back through decades to expose crimes that had seemed unsolvable, a catalyst for broader changes in how cold cases were investigated, and a source of hope for thousands of families who were still waiting for answers about their own unsolved losses. Fred Allen Linemann had thought his crimes were safely hidden in the past, but genetic genealogy was proving that some secrets can never be buried deep enough to escape the relentless advance of science and justice. The summer of 2025 brought a breakthrough that stunned even the investigators who had been working tirelessly to uncover the full scope of Fred Allen Linemann's crimes. Detective Sarah Martinez from Michigan had been right about the connection between Linemann and the 1973 murder of Rebecca Thompson. Advanced DNA analysis, using techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with degraded genetic material, confirmed that the same man who had killed Phyllis Baylor had also murdered Rebecca Thompson more than a year later and hundreds of miles away. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the investigative team and provided the first definitive proof that they were dealing with a serial killer whose activities had spanned multiple states and potentially numerous victims. The Rebecca Thompson case had haunted the Grand Rapids area for over 50 years. The 19-year-old college student had been driving home from her job at a local restaurant when her car broke down on a rural stretch of highway outside the city. Her body was found 3 days later in a wooded area several miles from her abandoned vehicle, bearing evidence of sexual assault and a single gunshot wound to the head. The similarities to the Phyllis Baylor case were striking, but it was the DNA evidence that provided the definitive link between the two crimes. Fred Allen Lieneman had killed both women using the same brutal methodology, confirming investigators' worst fears about the scope of his criminal activities. The genetic analysis that connected Lieneman to the Thompson murder represented a significant advance in forensic science. The DNA sample from the 1973 crime scene was severely degraded, having been stored for over 50 years under conditions that weren't ideal for genetic preservation. Traditional DNA analysis techniques would have been insufficient to generate a usable profile, but new methods for amplifying and analyzing degraded genetic material made it possible to extract enough information for comparison. The success in the Thompson case opened up possibilities for analyzing evidence from other potentially connected cases that had previously been considered too degraded for testing. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic geneticist who led the analysis of the Thompson case DNA, described the breakthrough as both scientifically exciting and emotionally overwhelming. The technical challenges of working with 50-year-old genetic material had pushed her laboratory to develop new techniques and procedures, advancing the field of forensic genetics in ways that would benefit future investigations. But the human impact of confirming that Lieneman was responsible for multiple murders was sobering, highlighting the real-world consequences of scientific advancement in criminal justice. The confirmation of Lieneman's connection to the Thompson murder triggered an avalanche of activity from law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Police departments that had been hesitant to commit resources to investigating potential connections suddenly found the justification they needed to pursue genetic testing of their own cold cases. The proof that Lieneman was indeed a serial killer transformed him from a person of interest in various unsolved cases to a priority suspect who warranted significant investigative resources. Rebecca Thompson's family experienced the same complex mix of emotions that Phyllis Baylor's daughter had felt upon learning her mother's killer had been identified. Margaret Thompson, Rebecca's younger sister, who was now in her 70s, had spent most of her adult life wondering who had killed her sister and why they had never been caught. The revelation that the killer was Fred Allen Lieneman, a man she had never heard of, who'd been dead for 40 years, provided answers but also raised new questions about justice, closure, and the nature of accountability when perpetrators can never face earthly consequences for their crimes. The psychological profile of Lieneman continued to evolve as more evidence emerged about his activities. Dr. Robert Chen's analysis suggested that Lieneman had been an organized serial killer who specifically targeted young women who were traveling alone and appeared vulnerable. The geographic spread of his confirmed crimes indicated someone who was mobile, either through employment that required travel or through a lifestyle that involved frequent movement between locations. The time gap between the Baylor and Thompson murders suggested that he might have been committing crimes more frequently than the solved cases indicated, raising troubling questions about other potential victims whose cases remained unsolved. The investigative team began developing a comprehensive timeline of Lienemann's movements and activities throughout the early to mid-1970s. This process required coordination between multiple agencies and access to records that were often incomplete or stored in outdated formats. Employment records, when available, showed a pattern of short-term jobs in various industries that would have provided Lienemann with reasons to travel and opportunities to encounter potential victims. Credit card records, primitive by modern standards, suggested spending patterns that placed him in areas where other unsolved crimes had occurred. One of the most disturbing aspects of the expanded investigation was the realization that Lienemann's crimes might have continued much longer than initially thought. His murder in Detroit in 1985 had occurred while he was facing first-degree murder charges, suggesting that his criminal activities had continued well into the 1980s. Investigators began examining unsolved cases from the entire span of Lienemann's adult life, recognizing that his criminal career might have lasted more than a decade and involved far more victims than anyone had initially realized. The financial cost of the expanded investigation was staggering, requiring resources from multiple jurisdictions and pushing the boundaries of what individual police departments could afford. The genetic genealogy analysis alone was expensive, with each case requiring thousands of dollars in laboratory fees, database searches, and genealogical research. The coordination between agencies required additional personnel, travel expenses, and administrative costs that strained budgets already stretched thin by other priorities. Federal grants and state funding became essential for maintaining the investigation at the scale needed to properly examine all potential connections. The technological challenges of the investigation pushed forensic laboratories to their limits and beyond. Some of the DNA evidence from potential connected cases was so degraded that new techniques had to be developed specifically for the Lienemann investigation. Laboratories found themselves investing in new equipment, training personnel in cutting-edge techniques, and collaborating with research institutions to push the boundaries of what was scientifically possible. The investigation became a driving force for advancement in forensic genetics, with techniques developed for the Lienemann cases being applied to other investigations across the country. The ethical implications of the investigation continued to generate debate and controversy. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the expanding use of genetic genealogy databases for criminal investigations, arguing that the original contributors to these databases had never consented to law enforcement access to their genetic information. The scope of the Lienemann investigation, which potentially involved analyzing dozens of cases across multiple states, intensified these concerns and led to calls for stronger privacy protections and clearer consent procedures for genetic database participation. Legal scholars began examining the precedents being set by the Lienemann investigation, particularly regarding the evidentiary standards for posthumous identifications based on genetic genealogy. Questions arose about whether such identifications should carry the same legal weight as traditional forensic evidence, how they should be presented in legal proceedings, and what standards of proof should be required when the accused cannot defend themselves due to death. These legal questions had implications far beyond the Lienemann case, potentially affecting how genetic genealogy evidence would be used in future investigations. The international aspects of the investigation became more complex as genetic genealogy revealed family connections that spanned multiple countries and continents. Some of the genetic matches that had led to Lienemann's identification came from international databases, and investigators found themselves navigating different privacy laws, legal systems, and jurisdictional boundaries. The global nature of genetic genealogy databases raised questions about sovereignty, international cooperation in criminal investigations, and the harmonization of laws governing genetic privacy across different countries. The media attention surrounding the expanded investigation reached unprecedented levels, with true crime documentaries, podcasts, and news programs covering every development in the case. The public fascination with genetic genealogy and cold case investigations created a market for content about the Lienemann case. But it also complicated the official investigation by generating speculation, misinformation, and interference from amateur investigators. Law enforcement agencies found themselves having to balance public interest in the case with the need to maintain investigative integrity and protect the privacy of victims. Families, the scientific community, watched the Lienemann investigation with intense interest, recognizing that it was pushing the boundaries of what genetic genealogy could accomplish and potentially setting precedents for future investigations. Research institutions began studying the methods used in the investigation, both to improve the techniques and to understand their limitations. Academic papers were being written about various aspects of the case, from the technical challenges of analyzing degraded DNA to the ethical implications of posthumous identification through genetic genealogy. The psychological impact on the investigators working the case was significant and often underestimated. The process of uncovering the full scope of Lienemann's crimes, of identifying additional victims and connecting with their families, of dealing with the media attention and public scrutiny, took a toll on the mental health and well-being of everyone involved. Police departments began providing additional counseling and support services for investigators working on high-profile cold cases, recognizing that the emotional demands of this type of work required special attention and care. As the investigation progressed through the summer and into the fall of 2025, the scope of Lienemann's potential crimes continued to expand. Each confirmed connection led to new possibilities, new cases to examine, new families to contact, and new questions to answer. The investigation had evolved from a single solved murder case into a comprehensive examination of serial killing in an era before modern forensic science, demonstrating both the power of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases and the limitations of criminal justice systems that lack advanced scientific tools. The impact of the Lienemann investigation extended far beyond the specific cases being examined. It had become a catalyst for broader changes in how cold cases were investigated, how genetic genealogy was funded and regulated, how law enforcement agencies cooperated across jurisdictions, and how the public understood the potential of modern forensic science. Fred Allen Lienemann had thought his crimes would remain hidden forever, but genetic genealogy was proving that no secret is buried so deep that science and determination cannot eventually bring it to light. By October 2025, the investigation into Fred Allen Lienemann's crimes had expanded to include potential connections to 17 unsolved cases across 7 states, making it one of the largest posthumous serial killer investigations in American history. The scope was unprecedented, requiring coordination between dozens of law enforcement agencies and pushing the boundaries of what genetic genealogy could accomplish. Each new potential connection brought its own challenges, its own evidence to analyze, and its own family hoping for answers after decades of uncertainty. The breakthrough that transformed the investigation from extraordinary to historic came from an unexpected source: a storage unit in Toledo, Ohio, that had belonged to Lienemann before his death. The unit had been abandoned when Lienemann was killed in 1985, and its contents had eventually been auctioned off to satisfy unpaid storage fees. The items had passed through several hands over the decades, but some had ended up in the possession of Robert Mitchell, a collector of vintage items who had purchased several boxes at estate sales without examining their contents carefully. Mitchell had followed the news coverage of the Lienemann investigation with growing unease, recognizing some of the locations and time periods mentioned in connection with the suspect. When he finally examined the boxes he had purchased years earlier, he discovered items that made his blood run cold: photographs of young women, newspaper clippings about unsolved murders, and personal effects that appeared to be trophies taken from victims. The discovery represented a serial killer's collection, a horrifying museum of violence that Lienemann had preserved as mementos of his crimes. The contents of Lienemann's collection were analyzed by forensic experts with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for archaeological artifacts. Each photograph was examined for clues about location, time period, and identity. Every newspaper clipping was cross-referenced with known cases and missing persons reports. The personal effects, including jewelry, clothing items, and other personal belongings, were tested for DNA evidence and compared against missing persons databases and unsolved case files. Dr. Maria Santos, the forensic anthropologist brought in to analyze the collection, described the experience as both scientifically fascinating and deeply disturbing. The methodical way that Lienemann had preserved and organized his trophies suggested a level of planning and psychological organization that contradicted some earlier assumptions about his crimes being purely opportunistic. The collection revealed a killer who took pride in his work, who revisited his crimes through photographs and mementos, and who had been far more active than anyone had previously suspected. The photographs in Lienemann's collection were particularly chilling, showing young women who appeared to be unaware they were being photographed. Some images seemed to have been taken from a distance, suggesting that Lienemann had been stalking potential victims before attacking them. Other photographs appeared to have been taken during or after assaults, providing evidence of crimes that might never have been reported or discovered. The forensic analysis of these images required specialized techniques to extract maximum information while preserving the evidence for potential future investigations. Among the most significant discoveries in Lienemann's collection was a photograph of Phyllis Baylor taken at what appeared to be a rest stop or gas station, showing her loading her 3-year-old daughter into their car. The image was clearly taken without Phyllis's knowledge, from a position that suggested Lienemann had been watching her before the attack that would claim her life. The photograph provided chilling evidence of premeditation and confirmed that the encounter between Lienemann and his victim had not been entirely random, as investigators had previously believed. The revelation that Lienemann had been stalking Phyllis Baylor before killing her added a new dimension of horror to an already tragic case. For her daughter, now 56 years old, the discovery meant that her mother's final hours had been even more terrifying than she had imagined. The photograph showed that Lienemann had been watching them, planning his attack, treating them as prey rather than human beings deserving of dignity and life. Several other items in the collection were matched to missing persons cases and unsolved murders, providing the first concrete evidence linking Lienemann to crimes that had remained mysteries for decades. A distinctive bracelet found in the collection matched the description of jewelry worn by Linda Patterson, a 22-year-old teacher who had disappeared while driving home from work in Ohio in 1974. A silk scarf matched evidence from the 1975 murder of Carol Anderson in Illinois. Each match represented not just a solved case, but a family finally receiving answers about their loved one's fate. The genetic analysis of items in Lienemann's collection yielded DNA evidence that definitively connected him to 6 additional murders and 2 disappearances that had previously been classified as missing persons cases. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 31, all young women who had been traveling alone when they encountered Lienemann. The geographic spread of the crimes confirmed that Lienemann had been operating across multiple states, using his mobility to avoid detection and exploit the limited coordination between law enforcement agencies in the 1970s. The psychological profile of Lienemann had to be completely revised in light of the evidence found in his collection. Dr. Robert Chen's analysis revealed a killer who was far more organized and methodical than originally thought. The careful preservation of trophies, the photographic documentation of stalking activities, and the systematic collection of news coverage about his crimes all pointed to someone who took pride in his work and derived ongoing satisfaction from reliving his violent acts. The discovery of Lineman's collection also provided disturbing insights into his methodology and victim selection. The photographs revealed that he had been targeting women who appeared to be traveling alone, often focusing on those who seemed lost, confused, or in need of assistance. Several images showed women at gas stations, rest stops and truck stops, locations where a predator could easily identify vulnerable targets. The evidence suggested that Lineman had developed a sophisticated system for finding and stalking potential victims, using his apparent normalcy to get close to women who had no reason to suspect danger. The impact on the families of newly identified victims was profound and complex. For some, like Linda Patterson's parents, both now in their 80s, the confirmation that their daughter had been murdered by Fred Allen Lineman provided closure after nearly 50 years of uncertainty. But it also brought renewed grief, forcing them to confront the reality of their daughter's final moments and the knowledge that she had been the victim of a serial killer who had taken trophies from her death. The legal implications of the collection's discovery were significant and unprecedented. While Lineman could never be prosecuted for his crimes due to his death, the evidence found in his possession provided definitive proof of his guilt in multiple cases. Legal scholars debated whether this posthumous evidence could be used to officially close cases, provide grounds for civil settlements, or establish legal precedents for similar situations in the future. The forensic analysis of Lineman's collection required resources and expertise that pushed several laboratories to their limits. The age and condition of the evidence required specialized techniques for DNA extraction and analysis. The photographs needed enhancement and comparison against historical records. The personal effects required careful cataloging and cross-referencing against missing persons databases that spanned multiple decades and jurisdictions. The international implications of the investigation became more complex as evidence emerged suggesting that Lineman might have committed crimes outside the United States. Some photographs in his collection appeared to have been taken in Canada, and travel records found among his personal effects suggested trips to Mexico and potentially other countries. International law enforcement agencies began examining their own cold cases for potential connections to Lineman, raising questions about jurisdiction, extradition, and the coordination of international criminal investigations. The ethical debates surrounding the investigation intensified with the discovery of Lineman's collection. Privacy advocates argued that the posthumous identification of a serial killer through genetic genealogy, while providing closure to families, also raised troubling questions about genetic surveillance and the potential for abuse of genetic databases. The scope of the investigation, which now involved analyzing evidence connected to dozens of potential victims, highlighted the need for clear ethical guidelines governing the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. The media attention surrounding the discovery of Lineman's collection was intense and sometimes problematic. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators began their own research into the items found, sometimes identifying potential victims or connections that had been missed by official investigators. But the attention also generated speculation, misinformation, and conspiracy theories that complicated the official investigation and caused additional distress to victims' families. The scientific community recognized that the Lineman investigation was setting important precedents for the use of genetic genealogy in serial killer investigations. Research institutions began studying the methods used to analyze the collection, the techniques for extracting DNA from aged evidence, and the procedures for coordinating multi-jurisdictional investigations. The case was becoming a landmark example of how modern forensic science could be applied to historical crimes. But it was also highlighting the need for continued research and development in the field. The psychological impact on the investigators working the case continued to be significant. The discovery of Linemann's collection, with its graphic evidence of his crimes and their impact on victims, took a toll on everyone involved in the analysis. Police departments began providing additional counseling and support services for investigators working on high-profile cold cases, recognizing that the emotional demands of this type of work required special attention and care. As 2025 drew to a close, the investigation into Fred Allen Linemann's crimes showed no signs of slowing down. Each piece of evidence found in his collection led to new possibilities, new cases to examine, new families to contact, and new questions to answer. The investigation had revealed the full scope of a serial killer's activities, demonstrating both the power of modern forensic science to solve historical crimes and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. No matter how much time has passed, the final revelations about Fred Allen Linemann came in December 2025, exactly 53 years and 5 months after he had murdered Phyllis Baylor on that dark Indiana highway. The discovery of his personal journals, hidden in a safety deposit box that had remained unopened since his death in 1985, provided the most chilling and comprehensive insight into the mind of a serial killer that investigators had ever encountered. The journals, written in Linemann's own hand, contained detailed accounts of his crimes, his victim selection methods, and his psychological motivations, offering a disturbing window into the mind of a predator who had terrorized the Midwest for over a decade. The safety deposit box had been discovered through financial records found among Linemann's possessions, records that had taken months to trace through banks that had changed names, merged or closed in the 40 years since his death. The box, located in a small bank in suburban Detroit, had remained sealed due to unpaid fees and the absence of anyone claiming to be Linemann's heir. When investigators finally gained access through court order, they found not only the journals but also additional photographs, maps with marked locations, and what appeared to be a meticulous record of his criminal activities spanning from 1971 to 1985. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a forensic psychologist specializing in serial killer psychology, led the analysis of Linemann's journals. Her team's examination revealed a level of planning, organization, and psychological sophistication that exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of his criminal activities. The journals documented not just the crimes that had been solved or suspected, but dozens of additional attacks, attempted abductions, and murders that had never been connected to Linemann or, in some cases, never reported to police at all. The entries began in 1971, when Linemann was 24 years old, with descriptions of stalking activities and attempted assaults that suggested he had been building up to murder for some time before killing Phyllis Baylor. The early entries revealed a man who was experimenting with different approaches, learning from failed attempts, and gradually developing the methods that would make him one of the most prolific unknown serial killers in American history. The progression documented in the journals showed classic escalation patterns that behavioral analysts had theorized about but rarely seen documented so thoroughly. The entry describing Phyllis Baylor's murder was particularly disturbing, written in a detached, almost clinical style that suggested Linemann viewed his victims as objects rather than human beings. He described stalking her at the gas station where he had taken the photograph found in his collection, following her car when she left, and planning the attack that would claim her life and traumatize her 3-year-old daughter. The entry revealed that the encounter had not been random as investigators had believed, but carefully planned and executed by a predator who had been watching and waiting for the right opportunity. The journals revealed that Linemann had been responsible for far More crimes than investigators had suspected. Even with their expanded investigation, his own count suggested he had killed at least 23 women across 7 states between 1971 and 1985, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Many of these crimes had never been connected to him, never been solved, and in some cases never been reported as murders at all, having been classified as accidents, suicides, or missing persons cases. The geographic scope of Lineman's activities, as documented in his journals, was staggering. He had operated across a territory that included Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, taking advantage of limited communication between law enforcement agencies and the primitive forensic capabilities of the era. His journals revealed a sophisticated understanding of police procedures, jurisdictional limitations, and investigative techniques, knowledge that he used to avoid detection and continue his crimes for over a decade. The psychological analysis of Lineman's writings revealed a personality that combined antisocial traits, sexual sadism, and an inflated sense of superiority that made him believe he was smarter than the police who were trying to catch him. Dr. Harper's team identified classic psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, grandiose self-image, and complete absence of remorse for his actions. The journals showed that Lineman viewed his crimes not as moral failings, but as achievements, games he was winning against both his victims and the law. Enforcement officers trying to stop him, the revelation that Lineman had documented his own crimes in such detail provided investigators with a roadmap for solving dozens of additional cold cases. But it also raised troubling questions about the limitations of the criminal justice system in the 1970s and 1980s. Many of the cases described in his journals had been investigated at the time, but the lack of advanced forensic techniques, limited communication between agencies, and absence of coordinated databases had allowed a prolific serial killer to operate with relative impunity for over a decade. The impact on victims' families was profound and varied. For some, like the relatives of women whose deaths had been classified as accidents or suicides, the revelation that their loved ones had actually been murdered by a serial killer brought a mixture of vindication and renewed grief. For others, like families who had spent decades believing their missing daughters might still be alive somewhere, the confirmation that they had been murdered was devastating, but also provided a form of closure that had been missing for decades, the legal implications of discovering. Lineman's journals were complex and unprecedented. While he could never be prosecuted for his crimes due to his death, his written confessions provided definitive evidence of guilt that could be used to officially close dozens of cases, provide grounds for civil settlements, and establish important legal precedents for similar situations in the future. Legal scholars began debating whether written confessions by deceased suspects should carry the same evidentiary weight as traditional forensic evidence, and what standards should be applied when evaluating such posthumous admissions. The forensic analysis of the journals themselves required specialized techniques to verify their authenticity and extract maximum information from the handwritten pages. Handwriting experts confirmed that the entries were indeed written by Lineman, while forensic chemists analyzed the ink and paper to verify the age and authenticity of the documents. The journals were photographed and digitized using high-resolution techniques that would preserve their contents for future analysis while protecting the original documents from degradation. The international implications of Lineman's crimes became clearer as investigators analyzed references in his journals to activities in Canada and Mexico. His writing suggested that he had committed crimes in at least 3 countries, taking advantage of limited international law enforcement cooperation in the 1970s and 1980s to avoid detection and continue his criminal activities. Canadian and Mexican law enforcement agencies began examining their own cold cases for potential connections to Lienemann, opening new avenues of investigation that might provide closure for additional families. The technological challenges of analyzing Lienemann's complete criminal record, as documented in his journals, required the development of new database systems and analytical tools. The sheer volume of information, combined with the need to cross-reference it against decades of case files from multiple jurisdictions, pushed existing investigative technologies to their limits. New software was developed specifically for the Lienemann investigation, tools that would later be used in other complex, multi-jurisdictional cold case investigations. The ethical debates surrounding the investigation reached their peak with the discovery of Lienemann's journals. Privacy advocates argued that the posthumous revelation of a serial killer's complete criminal record, while providing closure to families, also raised troubling questions about the privacy rights of victims and their families. The detailed descriptions of attacks in Lienemann's journals included information that some families preferred to keep private, creating difficult decisions about what information should be made public and what should remain confidential. The media attention surrounding the discovery of Lienemann's journals was unprecedented, with news outlets around the world covering the story of the serial killer who had documented his own crimes. The case became a symbol of the power of modern investigative techniques to solve historical crimes. But it also raised questions about the ethics of true crime coverage and the potential for sensationalizing victims suffering for entertainment value. The scientific community recognized that the Lienemann investigation represented a watershed moment in the application of genetic genealogy to serial killer cases. The combination of DNA evidence, genetic genealogy, traditional investigative techniques, and the discovery of the perpetrator's own records created a comprehensive picture of serial killing that had never been available to researchers before. Academic institutions began developing new research programs based on the methods and findings of the investigation. The psychological impact on law enforcement officers involved in the investigation was significant and long-lasting. The process of reading Lienemann's detailed descriptions of his crimes, of confronting the full scope of his violence, and of dealing with the media attention and public scrutiny took a toll on everyone involved. Police departments across the country began developing new protocols for supporting officers working on high-profile cold cases, recognizing that the emotional demands of this type of work required specialized support and care. As the investigation concluded in early 2026, the final tally of Lienemann's confirmed victims stood at 21 women across 4 countries, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in North American history. The investigation had solved dozens of cold cases, provided closure to numerous families, and demonstrated the unprecedented power of genetic genealogy combined with traditional investigative techniques. But perhaps most importantly, it had proven that no crime is too old, no killer too clever, and no secret too well hidden to escape the relentless advance of science and the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up. The case of Fred Allen Lienemann began with the murder of Phyllis Baylor on a dark Indiana highway in 1972 and ended with the revelation of a criminal career that spanned more than a decade and claimed dozens of lives. It demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed by decades, can still be achieved through the combination of scientific advancement, investigative persistence, and the refusal to let evil triumph. The 3-year-old girl, who survived that terrible night in 1972, finally had not just answers about her mother's death, but confirmation that the man responsible had been held accountable. If not in life, then in the revealing light of scientific truth that can reach across any span of time to expose even the darkest secrets. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.